On the morning of his 61st birthday, Richard was greeted by the soft, warm sunlight that gently illuminated the peaceful neighborhood where he had spent most of his years. Known for his modesty and kindness, he slowly stirred from sleep, his muscles stiff an all too familiar reminder of the years of hard work behind him. His career as an accountant had been steady and reliable, offering comfort through its predictability, though not without its trials. His unpretentious two-story home, which he shared with his wife Margaret, was just right for him. Richard had never sought wealth, but Margaret had always been ambitious, her sharp intellect and relentless drive allowing her to rise quickly in her career. This never failed to impress Richard, who admired her success and watched her navigate her professional life with grace and confidence. While he was content in his quieter role, he always stood by her, attending her work events and celebrating her victories as if they were his own. That morning, as he sipped his coffee, Richard found himself reflecting on his life, appreciating the significance of this milestone. His thoughts wandered back to his childhood in a small town, where his parents had instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity, principles that had shaped every decision he made. He also thought of his marriage, a relationship that had endured both joyous and difficult times, and how he had always strived to be the best husband he could be for Margaret. Although he wasn't usually one for deep reflection, Richard found himself thinking more about the future. He dreamed of traveling, seeing the places he had only read about, and hoped Margaret would join him on those adventures. He also wanted to spend more time with their grandchildren, passing on the wisdom he had gained over the years. Above all, Richard wished for their marriage to remain as strong as ever. The day carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Margaret had organized a gathering, inviting close friends and family to celebrate the occasion. Richard was grateful for her efforts, understanding how demanding her job was. The house was buzzing with preparations, and as always, Margaret oversaw everything with her signature flair, ensuring that everything would be perfect for the evening. Richard watched her from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. Margaret had always been the energetic force in their relationship, and he loved that about her. He admired how she could juggle so many responsibilities while remaining poised and graceful. He was also curious about the surprise she had hinted at, something she promised would make this birthday unforgettable. As guests began arriving, the house filled with laughter and the sound of clinking glasses. Richard moved through the crowd, chatting with old friends, many of whom he hadn't seen in years. They shared memories and stories, and a deep sense of gratitude washed over him as he realized that everyone present had, in some way, shaped his life. As the evening progressed and the sun set, casting a golden glow through the house, Richard felt a profound sense of peace. The celebration had been perfect, a reflection of the life he had built with Margaret. He watched her gracefully move through the crowd, the perfect hostess, and he was overwhelmed with gratitude for the woman he had married 4 decades ago. With soft music playing, Richard made his way to the kitchen to get more drinks. As he walked down the hallway, he paused to savor the sounds of laughter coming from the living room. The evening was exactly as he had envisioned, a celebration of a life lived with dignity. At that moment, Richard felt completely at peace, surrounded by love and friendship, unaware of the change that was about to come. As he approached the kitchen, he heard muffled laughter and voices coming from behind a slightly open door. Assuming it was just a few guests seeking some privacy, he thought little of it. But when he gently pushed the door open, what he saw made him freeze. In the middle of the kitchen, amidst the remnants of the evening's preparations, Margaret was locked in a passionate embrace with Charlie, her younger colleague. The scene unfolded in slow motion, a nightmare come to life. Richard's mind struggled to comprehend the betrayal before him. His heart pounded in his chest, and the once familiar kitchen now felt foreign, filled with an unbearable pain he had never imagined. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, unnoticed by Margaret and Charlie, who were too absorbed in each other to notice him. Only the sound of his ragged breathing broke the silence, causing them to turn in shock at his presence. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief, while Charlie's expression shifted from surprise to a smug grin. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice a mix of fury and confusion. The room seemed to shrink around him, the tension growing as he waited for answers that never came. The walls of his home felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. Regaining her composure, Margaret met his gaze without a hint of remorse. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said in an emotionless tone. "But since you have, let's handle this like adults." Richard's voice trembled with barely contained anger. "Handle what, Margaret? The fact that you're cheating on me?" In our home? At my own birthday party? Have you lost your mind, Charlie? Now leaning casually against the table, as if the situation amused him, smirked. Calm down, old man, he said dismissively, his arrogance palpable. What are you going to do about it? Each word felt like a knife to Richard, sharper than the last. A rage he had never felt before surged within him, erasing the love and trust he once had for Margaret in an instant. You think this is a joke, Richard growled, stepping forward. You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine without facing any consequences? Margaret raised a hand, her voice still cold and detached. Stop, Richard. I deserve happiness. I've worked harder than you ever did and achieved more. This is my life now, and I want you to leave me alone. Get out. Each word hit him like a blow, her calmness in dismissing their shared life, the years they had spent together, shattering something deep inside him. Charlie's grin broadened as he taunted, Face it, Richard. You were never enough for her, and you never will be. In that instant, something inside Richard snapped. Years of suppressed frustration and pain exploded in a violent outburst. He charged at Charlie, his fists flying. Charlie, unprepared for the force of the blow, staggered backward. Margaret screamed, trying to pull Richard off, but her cries were drowned out by the chaos. The kitchen became a war zone, glass shattered, furniture was knocked over, and the fight intensified. Stop, Richard. You're going to kill him, Margaret yelled, her voice filled with panic. But Richard was beyond reason, his mind clouded with fury. Only when Charlie lay on the floor, beaten and barely breathing, did Richard finally stop. His breath came in heavy gasps as he looked around at the destruction. His hands, stained with the evidence of his anger, trembled as the full weight of what he had done began to settle in. Margaret, pale and shaking, took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Richard, what have you done? She whispered. In a surge of uncontrollable emotion, Richard lashed out, striking Margaret across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room, marking the brutal conclusion to the violence. The overwhelming weight of the betrayal, his rage, and now this moment of finality crashed over him like a tidal wave. Staggering backward, Richard felt the consequences of his actions press down on him, crushing him under their enormity. From the living room, faint sounds of laughter and music drifted in, unaware of the storm that had erupted in the kitchen. Richard stood frozen, a cold wave of realization washing over him. Everything he had once thought was stable was now collapsing around him. What had begun as a festive evening had turned into a nightmare from which there would be no return. The chaos that had erupted in the kitchen quickly spread, its effects rippling through the entire house. Guests exchanged confused glances, startled by the sound of shattering glass and raised voices. Conversations that had once been lively dwindled into nervous whispers, replaced by anxious murmurs. The air grew thick with tension as Richard stormed out of the kitchen, leaving behind the ruins of his old life. "What's going on?" someone called out, but the question hung unanswered in the heavy atmosphere. Friends and family looked around nervously, unsure how to react to the sudden commotion. Richard pushed his way through the crowd, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and humiliation. His mind raced, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. All he could think about was escaping the curious stares and whispered comments. The front door slammed shut behind him as he stepped into the cool night air, his breath forming mist in the cold. He walked aimlessly down the quiet street, the sounds of the party gradually fading into the stillness of the night. With each step, the weight of betrayal grew heavier, the scene in the kitchen replaying in his mind over and over. Margaret and Charlie in each other's arms had shattered the illusion of his 40-year marriage in an instant. Back inside, Margaret stood frozen, trying to gather her thoughts while the guests watched in stunned silence. She knew she had to say something to regain control before things spiraled further. Clearing her throat, she forced a strained smile. "Everyone, please," she began, her voice tight with stress. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. Please enjoy the evening." Her words felt hollow, barely covering the truth, but it was enough to stop the flood of questions. Slowly, the guests returned to their conversations, though the atmosphere remained tense and filled with unspoken thoughts. Margaret could feel their judgmental stares, the weight of their silent reproach pressing down on her. As the night dragged on, Charlie, humiliated by the blow to his pride, quietly slipped away, unwilling to face the aftermath of his actions. Margaret watched him leave, bitterness and regret simmering beneath her calm exterior. Gradually, the guests began to depart, their farewells awkward, their expressions filled with unease. Margaret knew she couldn't avoid the confrontation with Richard much longer. She had to find him before the gap between them became too wide to bridge. She found him sitting on a park bench, bathed in the dim glow of the moonlight. Richard didn't look up as she approached, his face unreadable in the shadowy light. "Richard," Margaret called softly, her voice cautious as she tried to gauge his mood. "We need to talk." Richard remained motionless, his gaze fixed somewhere far off, as if she wasn't even there. The silence grew heavier, almost suffocating, until Margaret finally gathered her courage and spoke again. "We can't go on like this," she said, her voice firmer now. "We've been drifting apart for too long. Maybe it's time to face the truth and end this." Richard finally blinked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "End this?" he echoed quietly. "You destroy everything, and now you think the only way forward is to walk away?" Margaret crossed her arms, bracing herself for the difficult conversation ahead. "I'm just being honest, Richard. We've both been unhappy for a long time." Richard, who had always taken pride in the effort he put into his career and the independence he had fought so hard to maintain, wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. Rising to his feet, frustration boiling over, he locked eyes with Margaret. "Unhappy?" "I stood by you through everything." Margaret, his voice grew louder with each word. "I supported you when no one else would, and this is how you repay me." His disbelief filled the air, sharp and heavy. "You just don't get it," Margaret interrupted, her voice cold and tinged with bitterness. "You never really understood who I am. I need more than what you can offer, Richard. I want out of this marriage, and I'll get what I deserve. You can't stop me." Her words struck like a physical blow, leaving Richard breathless. The finality in her tone paralyzed him. Richard had always admired Margaret's ambition, but he never imagined she would use it to tear their life apart. Margaret turned abruptly, her footsteps echoing through the still night as she walked away, leaving Richard alone with the crushing weight of her ultimatum. He stood there, frozen in place, the reality of her words bearing down on him like a suffocating blanket. As her figure faded into the darkness, Richard sank back onto the bench, his emotions spiraling out of control. He began sifting through memories of their time together, trying to identify the moment when everything started to unravel. How had he missed the warning signs? When had Margaret become this distant stranger he barely recognized? The long night only deepened his introspection as he replayed each decision and compromise, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. Somewhere along the way he had lost himself, giving too much to someone who had stopped caring long ago. But now, as a storm of emotions surged within him, Richard realized he couldn't allow her betrayal to destroy him. He needed to reclaim his life, to fight back with the strength he had long forgotten. The celebration might have ended, but the real battle was just beginning. Taking a deep breath, Richard steeled himself for the difficult road ahead. The years of challenges had toughened him, and he knew he could survive this as well. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Richard sat in the kitchen, replaying the events of the previous night. Margaret's betrayal still hurt, but beneath the pain, a new resolve was forming. He understood that he couldn't allow her to take everything without a fight. He needed a plan to protect himself from her threats. Picking up his phone, Richard called a lawyer a trusted colleague had recommended. The first step was understanding his legal position, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The conversation with the lawyer was both enlightening and overwhelming. Richard learned about the complexities of dividing marital assets, the importance of gathering evidence, and how Margaret's infidelity could be used to his advantage during the divorce. Realizing how much was at stake, he knew he had to collect as much proof as possible. He began documenting everything: Margaret's sudden late-night absences, her suspicious behavior, and the incident with Charlie at the party. Though the situation seemed dire, Richard found comfort in realizing he wasn't completely alone. He needed an ally, someone who could help him navigate the coming challenges. Jennifer came to mind, his sharp-witted, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal friend from college. If anyone could help him make sense of this mess, it was her. They met at a quiet cafe, a familiar place where they had often shared life's ups and downs. As Richard recounted his story, Jennifer listened carefully, her expression growing more serious with each new detail. "Richard," she said firmly, her voice filled with determination, "you deserve better. You've been nothing but loyal, and now it's time to stand up for yourself. Don't let Margaret crush you. It's time to fight back." Her words rekindled a spark within Richard, reigniting a sense of purpose that had been dulled by years of self-sacrifice. Richard's resolve grew stronger with every word from Jennifer. Together, they devised strategies to counter the growing threats from Margaret. Jennifer recommended hiring a private investigator to gather solid evidence of Margaret's affair, which could be crucial in the divorce proceedings. Think of it as insurance, she advised. You need to be ready for anything she might throw at you. This wasn't just about protecting his finances or material possessions, it was about preserving his dignity and safeguarding the future he was determined to hold on to. Jennifer's support offered him a new perspective, and with her encouragement, Richard felt more clear-headed. He carefully planned his next steps, maintaining a calm front around Margaret while quietly building his case. He also took precautions with his finances, discreetly opening a new bank account and transferring funds to shield himself from any sudden financial moves Margaret might make. This gave him a small sense of control in an otherwise overwhelming situation. Over time, Richard became more adept at managing the tense atmosphere at home. He remained polite but distant, speaking to Margaret only when necessary, careful not to reveal his true intentions. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring constant vigilance and patience. At the same time, Richard began focusing on his own well-being, something he had neglected for years. He started exercising regularly, finding peace of mind and mental clarity in the rhythmic pounding of his feet as he ran. Physical activity became a form of therapy, helping him prepare mentally and physically for the battles ahead. He also reconnected with old friends whose relationships had faded over time. Their presence reminded him of who he had been before his marriage had consumed his identity. Their support helped him regain his self-worth, providing strength even as everything else seemed to be falling apart. Each day, Richard felt more prepared for the challenges he knew were coming. Although the path he had chosen was full of obstacles and uncertainty, he remained committed to his decision. The betrayal that had once shattered him now revealed a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Sitting alone in the stillness of his home, Richard felt the weight of the future pressing down on him, but he was ready. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to face it. This wasn't just about survival, it was a fight to defend the life he had worked so hard to build. In this struggle, he rediscovered his strength and sense of purpose. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the lively chaos of the party where it all began. The air was thick with tension as the divorce proceedings got underway. Richard sat on one side, his hands tightly clenched in his lap. After weeks of preparation, he felt fortified by the knowledge that he had done everything possible to protect himself. Beside him sat Jennifer, her presence filling him with confidence. On the opposite side, Margaret appeared calm and collected, her expression cold and poised. She had always been good at maintaining control, and now she seemed determined to claim what she believed was hers. Her attorney, a formidable figure known for winning tough cases, wasted no time in presenting a carefully crafted story, portraying Margaret as the victim in a marriage that had slowly fallen apart. She demanded a large share of their assets, arguing that her contributions to their lifestyle and financial independence justified her claims. Richard listened carefully, his heart pounding as he faced the moment he had dreaded losing everything he had worked for. But he steeled himself, reminding himself of the evidence he had gathered and the meticulous preparation he had put in place. When it was Richard's turn, his attorney stood to present their case. "Your Honor, we have evidence that not only proves Mrs. Taylor's infidelity but also reveals her professional misconduct. We believe this will greatly influence the court's decision regarding the division of assets." A tense silence filled the room as everyone's gaze shifted to Margaret, who shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Richard's lawyer meticulously laid out the evidence, including photos and documents that left little doubt about her betrayal. The private investigator's reports were comprehensive, detailing Margaret's affair with Charlie and exposing questionable behavior at her workplace. Margaret's downfall was swift. The undeniable proof of her misconduct revealed violations of both corporate policies and ethical standards. The courtroom reverberated with the reading of incriminating emails and messages, each one dismantling the well-crafted image she had worked so hard to protect. The atmosphere shifted as shock and disbelief spread through the room, with new revelations leaving everyone stunned. Margaret's lawyer attempted to object, but it was too late. The damage was already done. The judge's sharp, unforgiving gaze fell upon her. "Mrs. Taylor, these are serious accusations. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" His voice was firm, offering no space for evasive answers. Margaret hesitated, momentarily at a loss for words. The confidence she had maintained throughout the trial began to falter. She glanced desperately at her lawyer, but even he seemed helpless against the overwhelming evidence. Her posture slumped, betraying her growing anxiety, and her face showed a mix of anger and despair. "Your Honor, my personal life has no bearing on the division of assets," she insisted, trying to regain control of the situation. "I've worked hard for everything I have," she added defensively. The judge responded calmly but with finality. "That may be true, Mrs. Taylor, but the court must consider all aspects of this case, including your character and actions." As the trial continued, Richard felt momentum shift in his favor. One witness after another testified, supporting the claims against Margaret. Former colleagues spoke about her erratic behavior at work, while friends, though reluctantly, confirmed her infidelity. When the judge called a recess, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Richard sat quietly, feeling the weight of uncertainty still hanging over him. Regardless of the final outcome, he knew that this experience had changed him forever. When the judge returned, the tension in the room was palpable. Richard held his breath as the judge began to speak. After reviewing all the evidence, the court rules in favor of Mr. Taylor, the judge declared. Mrs. Taylor's actions are deemed harmful, and the division of assets will reflect this. Mr. Taylor will retain the majority of the marital property, and no alimony will be awarded. A wave of relief swept over Richard, washing away months of stress and anxiety. Seated beside him, Jennifer squeezed his hand, her eyes glowing with pride and support. On the other side of the courtroom, Margaret sat in stunned silence, fully grasping the gravity of her situation. Despite everything, Richard felt a fleeting sense of pity. He had once loved her deeply, and the end of their marriage was a bittersweet conclusion to their shared past. Outside, the sun shone brightly, in stark contrast to the emotional storm that had raged within. Richard took a deep breath, feeling an immense burden lift from his shoulders. He hadn't fought out of revenge or malice, but to defend the life he had worked so hard to build. Although he knew challenges still lay ahead, and the memories of this painful chapter would haunt him, he felt stronger, more resilient, and prepared for whatever the future held. As he and Jennifer walked away from the courthouse, a faint smile crossed his face. It felt like the start of a new beginning, a chance to rebuild his life and rediscover his identity. In the weeks following the trial, the fallout from the case hit Margaret hard. The revelations of her professional misconduct and affair with Charlie obliterated her once unassailable reputation. The corporate world where she had once flourished quickly distanced itself from her, and the company she had dedicated so much of her life to could no longer tolerate the scandal. Her dismissal was swift and harsh, marking a humiliating end to the career she once thought was untouchable. Charlie, who had benefited from Margaret's success and leveraged her position to his advantage, found himself in a similar predicament. With Margaret's downfall, his professional connections evaporated, and the opportunities he had taken for granted disappeared. The colleagues who had once welcomed him now avoided him, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. Without Margaret's influence, his career crumbled. The bitter truth hit them both hard. Margaret and Charlie, once enjoying the perks and luxuries their careers provided, now faced the harsh reality of starting over with nothing. What had once seemed like an exhilarating affair of secret indulgences had turned into the catalyst for their undoing. Their lives had become a grim reminder of the dangers of arrogance and infidelity. For Richard, the end of the legal battle wasn't just a conclusion, it marked the beginning of an unexpected journey. While the victory in court had been exhausting, it brought him a surprising sense of freedom and relief. The heavy weight of a failed marriage, compounded by the pain of betrayal, had finally been lifted. Free from these burdens, he could now focus on himself and his own desires, no longer constrained by Margaret's relentless ambitions. Old passions re-emerged, and new interests took shape with renewed energy. Photography, once a forgotten hobby, became his way of reconnecting with the world around him. Each time he pressed the shutter, it wasn't just a photo, it was a moment in his path toward rediscovery and joy. He traveled to the places he had always dreamed of visiting, each journey reminding him that his life now belonged to him alone. In this new chapter, the unwavering support of friends and family became Richard's foundation. Their presence provided him with much-needed stability during his darkest times, highlighting the importance of genuine relationships. Among those people, Jennifer's constant support stood out. Their friendship deepened, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. Richard often reflected on the hardships he had endured: betrayal, divorce, and his desperate fight to regain his self-worth. These challenges had pushed him to his limits, but he emerged stronger, with a clearer understanding of what truly mattered. He learned to appreciate the lessons his marriage had taught him, realizing that despite its bitter end, there had been moments of real happiness and personal growth. Instead of dwelling on regret, he cherished those memories as milestones on his journey to self-awareness. As he stepped into this new phase of life, Richard found a peace he had not expected. A quiet sense of satisfaction came from finally living on his own terms. Standing on the edge of this fresh start, he looked to the future with optimism, grateful for the wisdom his past had given him and ready for whatever came next. Margaret's downfall had left her utterly alone. She had no job, no home, and no friends to support her. The stress and turmoil she faced eventually led to a stroke, leaving her bedridden and helpless. Perhaps it was karma that had caught up with Margaret for her wrongdoings. And so, my friend, this is the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.